Alejandra, thank you for joining me and the National Center for Peace and Conflict Studies in Dunedin at the University of Otago. Alejandra Ortiz-Ayala is a colleague of mine at NCPACS, a fellow PhD candidate. And I take it that now you are awaiting your examiner's comments on the thesis. So good luck with that. And thank you for joining us in what is, I think, a rather difficult moment for you, given what is happening back home in Colombia, which is what I would like to speak to you about. So Alejandra, welcome.
Thank you, Sanjana, for doing this. Yes, it's true. There's been tough times for many of Colombians. Even if we are far away from home, you still feel that it's been there. So.
I know. And you know, I thank you for taking the time to talk about this, because in informal collegial conversations we've had, something that you've repeatedly told me, which is kind of what gave rise to this conversation as well, is that what you saw and determined through your doctoral research is sadly now what is unfolding in Colombia. Could you explain that as a start, I suppose, to our conversation?
Yes, well, Sanjana, in 2014, I got a job as a consultant for the security forces. 2014, we were in the negotiation of the peace agreement with the FARC. And at that time, the government was aiming to sign the peace agreement. And there were a group of civilians and soldiers and policemen that were part of the government in the Havana that were placed the negotiation.
Yeah.
But on the ground, I mean, in the military in Colombia, they were also preparing themselves to kind of the change of what that will imply for the country, what will imply that for the security forces. But kind of the concern of them were more related with the transitional justice, for example, what is going to happen with their reputation, the institutional legitimacy. And few of them were kind of thinking about like stuff like security sector reform, because the police in Colombia is attached to the military. Both of them are under the Minister of Defense. So some of these institutional designs were on the table, but unfortunately, in my eyes, the security sector reform was not part of the peace agenda. And that's make the Colombia peace agreement kind of different from other peace agreements. So there were not institutional reforms in the central stage. Everything was basically focused on the process of disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of the rebels, but nothing happened like in terms of the transformation of the state. And because of my experience working with the soldiers after years or listening them, like trying to figure out their narratives and their kind of arguments about, if you want to say their own interpretation of the conflict, how they see it. Because I need to acknowledge that the soldiers in Colombia are the ones who really know the territory. They've been in places that not many politicians been present before. So I was kind of wondering of what that implies for them, the peace agreement, and what kind of transformation in terms of the mentality of the relationship that they have with civilians will probably need to be addressed because of the peace agreement. But because we didn't have this security sector reform, or because we didn't start a conversation of this potential transformation inside of the security forces, I was concerned because in their narratives, the idea that the left wing, which is the political identity of the insurgencies in Colombia, that also is, there is also civilians who identify with some of the agenda of these ideologies being criminalized historically. And in the mind of the security forces, or if you want to say in these institutions, people and social groups that are related with these ideologies are still enemies and threats. And in their eyes, they are criminals. And if you are against of the status quo, if you are kind of protesting in the streets because everything that you disagree with the status quo in the eyes of the security forces, including the police, I mean, security forces as a whole, these civilians are labeled as threats of the stability of the state, and even in their eyes, in the narratives of the soldiers and the police, they're threats to the democracy.
Yeah.
So when I saw that, I was like, this is very bad, because usually the literature and other cases are teaching us that after peace agreements, usually there is a lot of like social protests. There are a lot of like kind of adjustments of the new reality, and we were expecting this. We were expecting like massive social mobilizations, and people will be more concentrated in stuff that they were probably left because of the fight with the guerrillas. So now we can talk about other things like inequality or other stuff. But
so, I mean, given what you saw, and you might have been one of very few, perhaps we can come to more contemporary and the more tragic events of the past couple of weeks, which I think is more broadly known. So you don't have to be an academic in a sense to know what's happening in Colombia today, but it might still for Aotearoa and those in New Zealand be somewhat, well, it is geographically distant, but it's also somewhat, I think, perhaps confusing because you have competing news cycles with what's happening in Gaza and Israel, in Myanmar, and Colombia might not be in both the media framing and the popular imagination of those here. So my specific question is, Alejandra, it would appear to be the case that the most recent violence is because of something I would imagine for those here in Aotearoa quite strange around tax reform. And you and I both know that, this country is very, very different. So the question is, why are people on the streets for something that for most here in Aotearoa would be something quite, non-violent, which is a tax reform? Why was that the proxy trigger for what we are seeing in Colombia today?
Well, first, I think that New Zealand, yes, we are far away from New Zealand somehow, but New Zealand is one of the few countries who's been accepting Colombian refugees since 2007. So, and actually the last time was in 2018, and they accept around 800 Colombian refugees. Some of them are located in Ibercargill. So even though New Zealand is geographically distant from Colombia, they've been very aware of the situation back home and helping some of Colombian nationalities.
Which I will ask you about towards the end of the conversation.
So, well, the thing with the tax reform is that was just an excuse for a lot of people to actually put on the table the huge inequality that was exacerbated because of the pandemic. So actually the tax reform was a very bad idea, because in terms of the popularity of the reform, they will tax especially people from middle and low classes. And the data is showing us that the pandemic, especially in the big cities, make people, and I'm going to give you the data because in terms of proportion for New Zealand can be like a scandalous thing, considering the population here. So 30.5 million people fell into poverty over 1 year.
Yeah.
Women and young people disproportionately being affected.
Yeah.
I say 3.5 million people. New Zealand have 4,000 something, so it's a huge percentage if we all just compare it in terms of proportions. So this was just a reaction of the people and say, why are you going to do this tax reform when we have all of this huge inequality that is being exacerbated? Because So this was just the start, but actually Colombia have protests in the past 2 years. So one was in November 2019, and other one was in 2020. So somehow before of the pandemic, there were a kind of a mobilization against the government because of the lack of willingness to implement the peace agreement, for example. Also because things related with corruption in the government,
Yeah.
the increase of insecurity in the areas that were formerly controlled by the rebels. So the rebels were not there. And in theory, that we suppose is that the government will arrive into those areas, but the strategic of the government was just militarization of those areas, but not necessarily like a
Now, Alejandra, here's the thing. The proposals were withdrawn, as I understand it, on the 2nd of May. The minister responsible for drawing up the proposals also resigned. So, one could pose the question to you, what's the problem now? Haven't the protesters won? Because there's nothing on the table around that which gave rise to the protests in the first place. So what is fueling the protests on the street up until today?
Well, because the reaction of the government of this protest was violent. Police brutality was huge. Militarization of the cities were huge. So yes, we dropped that. We don't have the tax reform anymore. There is not, some of the ministers are not in the position anymore, but the government refused to talk with the people. They are actually the people who represent the people, the protesters that are in the streets, are people from unions that are 50 years old or like very old people who doesn't represent the population who is in the street, that is many people of my age. People of my age never been formally employee. So we didn't even join a union because it's not part of our experience. So there is a kind of this connection between the elites and the narratives of the elites. If you hear the elites, they label the protesters as terrorists. And the narrative is that the protesters are using kind of strategies from the international community that are organizing people to delegitimize the government of Colombia and the elites in Colombia. So the narrative of the elite is very stigmatizing, and I'm actually very concerned because there is no possibility of the negotiation if the leaders of the country are just thinking that these people are just vandalism, criminals, or it's not worth it to talk to them.
Now, I'm quoting from an Al Jazeera article a couple of days ago, which highlights Elizabeth Dickinson, a senior analyst for the International Crisis Group in Colombia, who says, and I quote, "National level discussions set the tone for what's happening across the country, but do not address local grievances of protesters." So, end quote. Alejandra, what are, you made the point about the non-representation of your demographic, putting me as the interviewer in an unfortunate position of not, I have to not ask your age, but perhaps ask the demographic that is not being represented. And the second twinned question is, what are those local grievances from that demographic that is not being addressed?
I'm going to give you the example of Cali, that is hometown of my family, when they were the highest levels of violence and brutality been located in that area. That area have an accumulation of historical debts. There is Afro-Colombian communities that are located in one of the most important ports of the country, but the people who live that area is actually one of the most poor people in the country. So yes, because of their work, there is a lot of income or like national income to the country, but they don't have any from that. They just work there, but the living conditions are very poorly. Also, that city is actually divided, but the south of the city is for the posh people, and the north of the city is from the poor and the criminal gangs and all of that. And there is a confrontation between them. Actually, there is video of civilians in arms with the complicity of the police fighting the civilians that are protesting that come from this other side of the city. But that just to give you an impression of the grievances are related with a huge and deep social inequality that for the first time is happening in the big cities. And I just want to clarify this because it will be unfair to say that this is new in the context of Colombia. This inequality is something that people in the rural areas and the peripheries have been living for decades.
Yeah.
But now, because in the big cities, people is feeling it. It's people who is in my age that is called, say, like in the last 30 decades, like three decades. I'm 30 years old. People who's 20 years old, that some of us have the opportunity to study, but that doesn't mean guarantee that we're going to get any jobs, or people who even have the chance to study. The privatization of the schools, for example. If you want to pursue a better life in Colombia, you need to go to particular schools that are usually the school for the rich people. So even if you're born in the poor family, there is no way that you're going to advance in your life. I can give you an example of a more like global perspective. The OECD organization, they have a chart where they have the number of generations that are country required to achieve the middle income according with the OECD. Colombia is in the bottom, and you require 11 generations to reach the middle income. Denmark need 2. New Zealand, I think, is around 4. So this is the reality. And people is still in the street because they don't have anything to lose.
Yeah. So on that point, though, and pardon me for asking what might be a disturbing question, because the death toll is disputed. Human Rights Watch a couple of days ago said its credible reports suggest that it's around 69. Government figures from another report a couple of days ago say it's as low as 17. There are other reports that suggest that about 2,300 civilians and uniformed personnel have been injured. Now, you obviously have good ties with not just family, but also friends and colleagues on the ground in Colombia. What are you hearing? What are the numbers really?
It's a great question. We don't have transparency about the question. Actually, most part of the data come from non-profit organizations that have been trying to track, for example, sexual assault from the police officers to civilians, disappearance. That's for me is being very critical, because we don't have we have a data, but the government is saying that these cases are not true. Then these other people is saying that it's true, and it's huge numbers, like thousands, like hundreds of them. Some of the people who's been died or losing their eyes because of the arms of the police, all of that, there is not enough transparency about the data, because you cannot trust the formal state institutions. So if we have numbers, it's mainly because of the civilians organizations.
Now, the New York Times. Let's go into specifics. And one of the things I really wanted to ask of you is something that very sadly resonates with my country as well, which is police brutality and the torture, assault, murder of those in custody, as well as just questions around the violence associated with elite units of the police in general. Now that's Sri Lanka, but it seems to be very strangely resonant with Colombia. A New York Times visual investigation, I'm sure you've seen this, from the 27th of May, published visual documentation of a couple of things: assaults in custody, the reckless use of live fire, firing less lethal munitions at close range against protesters, of course, firing less lethal munitions at volunteer medics, and perhaps most disturbingly, the shooting and killing on streets. Now, this is a litany of issues. The NYT has visual evidence from documented video and photography from protesters and the smartphones that they've had. Is this congruent with what you have been hearing and studying as well, Alejandra? Is this new? Has this been happening? And what is the nature of what is being called for by the protesters in relation to alleged police brutality in your country?
Well, You're right. I mean, the resemblance of this with other contexts, even the states, is huge. And here I want to elevate the discussion, not for the Colombian context, but this is a question about how democracies, contemporary democracies, are handled protesters and activists, and people who is demanding from the democratic institutions or the traditional institutions more deeply reforms. I mean, this is beyond of the demands of the people nowadays are kind of putting in the conversation more structural conversations about how we handle the economy and politics. And democracies don't know how to handle this. And what they are doing is usually put the police on the streets and the military in some of the cases. But actually the training of the police, even in the States, is very militarized. So the mentality that these policemen are going into the street is not to de-escalate the conflict. It's the opposite, because what they are doing is kind of seeing the civilians as enemies, and they are training in that manner.
Right.
So democracies are for me, it's like a cognitive dissonance of the contemporary democracies about how they are handling the demands of the people in the name of civil rights opportunities, change the way that we think, how we manage our economy, our policies. And the traditional elites don't know how to handle this. So I will say that in the case of Colombia, of course, there is it is more exacerbated because of the history of civil war and other characteristics. But the logics are kind of similar to, or I can see a pattern in other contexts that are not necessarily, don't have this path of civil war experiences as Colombia. So for me, this is a deep question for democracies nowadays. And if you look into the data, the dissatisfaction towards the democratic institution is huge globally. And if the democracies are unable to handle the relationship with civilians beyond coercion, this can open more dangerous zones, because what is happening is that societies start to break internally. So you have people who, and that's happening in Colombia, you have today people who is in the streets and protesting against the people who've been protesting all this month. And these people is in favor of the police and the status quo and all of that. So you have people. Yeah.
No, I understand that from the global perspective, but I did want to focus on Colombia because that's really where you can speak to with the greatest authority. And my understanding is, I don't know how to pronounce it, but ESMAD or ESMAD, which is the ESMAD, which is the riot police, the elite unit, the SWAT, if you will, of Colombian police. There's a lot of concern and public protests against the tactics that they are using. And in general, as you know full well, overall police reform. So are you aware of specific asks by the protesters around the reform agenda? And if so, what would the key points be?
Well, this is what disagree with the traditional debates, is that people want institutional reform the security sectors, they say the police. But for me, institutional reforms are not enough if that are unable to change the mentality of the people who are part of these institutions. And the worst part is that even if the institutional reforms are in place, if there is people in the civilians and in the elites that they still consider the use of violence by the state forces as legitimacy, even like this kind of weapons or all of that in the name of the democracy, how about going to change? Doesn't matter, you can change whatever in paper. But what is happening in the context, at least of Colombia, is that you have an important portion of the population who actually believe that what the government is doing and what the police and the way that the police is behaving is correct. that that's the way to defend the democracy. And that's the narratives that they use, that they are doing this in the name of the democracies, that they are doing this to protect the human rights of the civilians who are not protesting. So if you have kind of these narratives, and then you have these other ones who actually want the other, like, if you want the extreme ones to want like no more police or disarming the police or these other narratives. So you don't have a point of conversation here. And that's the scary part, that you are talking with people who are in very extreme positions. So the possibility of a negotiation is not in place. And even if there is a kind of intention of reform that I'm very skeptical about it in the case of Colombia, the effectiveness of that reforms are very low.
So, I mean, which is a nice segue in a sense to my next question, which is, and I'm sorry to again bring this up, but an Al Jazeera report yesterday suggests that upwards of 14 people have died in Cali, just after Friday, by the way, which is very, very concerning, and has resulted in a statement by the UN Human Rights Commissioner and the Human Rights Commission, and I quote from the statement: "It is essential that all those who are reportedly involved in causing injury or death, including state officials, are subject to prompt, effective, independent, impartial, and transparent investigations, and that those responsible are held accountable," end quote. Now, the UN can make statements, but as you and I both know, there is a big divide between the statements made and coming out of Geneva, important and useful as they may be, and ground conditions. This is home. This is your hometown. The death toll is significant. And now the UN has made a statement. Where do you think it's going to go from here? Do you think, for example, and if I'm being more specific, that what is called for by the UN is actually going to come about?
Well, the government refused the visit of the international organization to monitoring the situation. And in the narratives of the elite is that actually this is, all of this is international propaganda against the government. I mean, they've basically been saying like, oh, the UN didn't understand what is actually happening home. This is just a criminal organization and terrorist people doing stuff. They actually, the acknowledge of the police brutality is not being in their mouth in any other declarations. At the contrary, the leaders are being visiting military and police units, telling them, you are the heroes of this country, you are doing everything right. And that's the scary part. I mean, there is not, I mean, if the leaders are telling the security forces that they are doing good, I mean, the possibility of
that's a problem.
I mean, there is not critic. I mean,
so I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what you're essentially saying is that you're rather skeptical of anything progressive or positive coming as a consequence of the UN report statement, rather.
Well, I think there's possibilities. I mean, and this is me being like the practical political terms. Is that the international community can pressure a lot the government, because most part of the money that come from the peace agreement implementation and there is a lot of money that come from international support. That's how you can do it. As well, the US have a lot of investment in the military and the police in Colombia. So the way that they can actually somehow pressure the government to do something about it is putting conditions about that money that come to our country. I mean, I'm sure that a lot of people in the UN, EU, and in the state don't want to know that the money that they pay for taxes is going to certain institutions that are kind of questioning because of violation of human rights. So that's how the international community can do it. So even though sounds like not possible, but there is ways.
I want to go back to something in my penultimate question to you. You mentioned that the state and the police in particular are suggesting that some of the narratives are fake, fake news, are constructed and, is basically fiction to make them look bad or, serve the agendas of others or whatever. I mean, this is a very familiar discourse to activists and civil society in Sri Lanka as well. So the language is bizarrely, very, very similar. But for Aotearoa, given that, some of these narratives are projected by the state and the police to be fake, the numbers are contested, the narratives are contested. How Alejandra how do you respond to that? How does one figure out, given that there are the numbers are difficult to come by, there are multiple competing narratives here. How can you help those in Aotearoa figure out actually what's going on?
Well, I believe that nowadays you have more access to information directly from the civil society. You don't need to reach like traditional news. And even when you reached on the ground, you can see the nuances as well. Yep. And make your own kind of understanding, because it is true that you have certain narratives that portray what is happening back home as an intention of desestabilization, and then people connected with what's happening in Chile, what is happening in Brazil, what is been happening in Ecuador, and people fairly can just say like, yes, this is intention of the left wing to yep. take over Latin America. I don't know, but the narratives of the people who is in the street, that's what is actually what, in my eyes, is what really matters, is understand what are these. There are kids, some of these are people of 20 years old that are in the streets, why they're doing this, where they're putting their life in risk in this manner. Yep. Listen, their narratives is what really matters. I mean, social media, who is not putting any agenda and just provided the channels to give them a voice, is the media that I will just prefer to people to prioritize, because the other things are just political agendas. We have a presidential election in a year, so yep. there is yep. a lot of things happening here that a lot of leaders are taking advantage of. Yep. Any of that is yep. actually putting the attention of what people need and wants from the leaders.
As my final question, I want to go back to where you started, which is the important point that you made, that although geographically very distant, Aotearoa, New Zealand has taken in refugees from Colombia, as well as recently as 2018, before the pandemic. So in that sense, the countries are connected and continue to be connected, bilaterally and multilaterally in terms of relations as well. Now, I asked this last week of Dr. Nijme Ali, where we talked about the situation in Israel with the Palestinian people and the unrest in recent weeks. And I'm going to pose the same question to you. If I were to ask you, what questions should the New Zealand government be asking around this situation? So I don't want recommendations, but I want, from your perspective, questions they should be asking, things and issues and perspectives they should be focusing on. What would you say in response?
I think that considering the position of New Zealand regarding, for example, weapons in the police, there is a huge narrative here in New Zealand about the police here doesn't have ones. And actually, yep. after the Christchurch attack, there were a huge debate because there were an important portion of the population who want to arm the police again. And I will say that New Zealand somehow have the authority to ask the Colombian questions about their willingness to clarify and like as a way of accountability of the behavior of the security forces. And accountability also symbolically. This is not just about the law doing their job, because that's what the narrative of the government is saying. It's like, oh, we are just waiting for the law to resolve this, without actually acknowledging in the present what is happening. I mean,
Yep.
there is a disproportional use of the force in the police that need to be addressed and acknowledged by the Colombian government. And I think that New Zealand and other countries can actually advocate for that to the Colombian government.
Now, sorry, I said it is a final question, but just to follow up very quickly, I would imagine that there's a large Colombian diaspora here in New Zealand, not just in Dunedin and at the University of Otago, but North Island and around Auckland and New Zealand and Aotearoa at large as well. Do you know of anything that the diaspora is doing to ask the government of Aotearoa, New Zealand, to more proactively get involved and engaged with what's happening and unfolding in Colombia?
Yes, the people of Colombia here in New Zealand, they wrote a letter to the New Zealand government.
Yep.
And
when was this?
Like 2 weeks ago.
Yep.
More than 2 weeks
Yep.
ago. We have also signs, petitions. We had a coordinator demonstration in all cities of New Zealand 2 weeks ago as well. So I know that the government of New Zealand is kind of aware of what
Yep.
is going on.
Yep.
So hopefully we will get some response from them soon.
Thank you, Alejandra, for that answer, but also for joining myself and NCPACS, our institutional home at Otago. Muchas gracias for your time and also, for sharing your thoughts in what is undoubtedly a very difficult time. I know how difficult it must be and the emotional toll it takes. So for taking the time out and for joining me and NCPACS for this conversation, thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me and giving me this space.